Ready. Oh, what happened there? Oh, good morning, everyone. Welcome officially to Monday. Um, Tuesday. Is that what today is? Tuesday?
Yes. No Monday.
Who knows anymore, right?
I don't want to go back to Monday.
You don't want to go back to Monday? Bad memories of Monday?
Mm.
Yeah, or just Monday in general?
Monday.
Yeah, I know. I don't know. I had a really happy like Monday morning when I think I told you when I woke up and the clock we hadn't changed the clock. So yeah, oh man, I think that's the happiest I've been. Good morning. I think that's the happiest I've been all week. Learning that I had an extra hour to sleep, I was just so good. Anyway, good morning to all of you. What we'll do today is two things. We'll do a little bit more about BC First Nations. We'll talk a little bit about the field trip a bit more, and then I will give you the final assignment because that's coming up very, very quickly. You're giving me a look like, what's this? What's this about? I'll give you the final assignment because, of course, you will need a few weeks to work on it. And so I will provide it to you today. I'll explain what it's about. There'll be more stuff coming in the next few weeks to you to allow you to get going. But this is kind of me telling you what it is. But we'll get to that a little bit later, okay? We'll say good morning here to Victoria and to Shota and to Kayla. And then we will, good morning to all of you. And then we will get going. Interesting. Did I put it here? Oh, no, it's not there. Interesting. Okay. Give me just 1 second here. Just got to do something with my streaming software. And that is, I wonder where that went. I dragged it somewhere. Then it vanished. No, that's not what I meant to do. This is what I meant to do. There we go. Okay. So, yesterday we were talking about, BC's First Nations, right? A varied group of people, and again, kind of the subject of what we'll see on Friday on the field trip. So, the Museum of Anthropology has stuff from all around the world, but mostly from First Nations of British Columbia. So we'll actually get to see some of these cultural objects and kind of experience them in a pretty interesting way, I think. But more about that later. We talked a little bit about terminology yesterday, what kind of terms are kind of respectful and accurate and sort of used, and which ones are, for the most part, we've left in the past because they're kind of, they have kind of racist feelings about them, or they have colonial feelings, and so we kind of don't use, again, Indian is kind of a word that only gets used in terms of legal stuff, but Indigenous or First Nations or First People are kind of more preferred, right? And we said, of course, that First Nations and First People make sense because these are the first people to arrive in North America, right? There was really no way into North America prior to about 15,000 years ago or so, because the top part was covered in ice, right? And the people in Asia didn't really have boats that could sail across the ocean. They didn't know that North America was there even. And so, North America was unpopulated. There were really no humans here, which is kind of wild, right? Can you imagine this entire continent with not a single human on it? Wild, right? But anyway, around 15,000 years ago, those glaciers start to melt. And again, there's a period where people can walk right across from Northeast Asia into North America, and they do, right? And those are kind of the ancestors of the first peoples of Canada, but also of the United States, of Southern America. If you've heard of we talked about the Aztec just this morning, but also in this class before, their ancestors kind of come into North America around this time. If you know about the Incas or the Olmecs, those are people whose ancestors come in around this time as well, right? So all kind of indigenous people in North America and South America are kind of related to the people who start moving in here around 15,000 years ago. Yeah, so I'm just going to jump ahead a little bit here. Yeah, so we have some archaeological sites. I just thought I'd show you this. Some archaeological sites that identify that people were actually here following that melting of the glaciers, right? So you can see some archaeological sites from 12,500 years ago, 10.3 thousand years ago, 14.1 thousand years ago. And so, yeah, people were starting to move in around that time. We also have some DNA evidence, but I won't really go into that because that's too much. We said the first people to show up here were hunter-gatherers, of course, and we're pretty familiar with hunter-gatherers, having been introduced to them in the first part of the course, right? And so we talked about the difference between simple and complex hunter-gatherers. We met some simple hunter-gatherers, the Hadza, right? And we, in a video, we kind of got to hang out with them a little bit and see what they were like. But we said that the indigenous people, at least in this part of North America, kind of fit into the complex forager category. Okay? So they have kind of bigger settlements, bigger villages. They live in greater numbers. They store their food. They have things, right? They have a lot of stuff. They have social hierarchies. And they kind of collect their food at certain times of the year, right? So instead of just eating whatever is around, they really focus on certain foods at certain times of the year and then store it away for the winter, right? And let me just jump ahead here. Yeah, and we said that really the resource that allows them to do this, so the resource that allows them to move from simple foraging to a more complex form of foraging is the salmon, right? And so this probably happens around 3,000 to 5,000 years ago. And so for a long time, people in this part of the world are simple foragers, moving around, kind of eating and hunting whatever they find. But again, around 3,000 to 5,000 years ago, people start to switch, right? They start to store more food. They start to target certain resources. And again, the salmon is a very important part of that transition, right? That's what's going to allow them to do this.
Does British Columbia have any places to grow carbohydrates?
To grow
For example,
rice?
rice?
No, I don't think there's any rice grown here. I think it's too cold.
I'm just asking for that because to grow carbohydrates, we need sunshine to
Yeah.
grow them.
Yeah, so the carbohydrates that would have been available to First Nations people here probably would have been berries, right? So berries that grow on bushes. What else might there have been? What's that? What? Dates? No. None of that grows here.
Dates and walnuts.
Yeah. Yeah, there's not nuts maybe. Well, nuts are kind of half carb, half fat. But pine nuts were available, berries were available. There might be some root vegetables that you can find around here, but most of what these people would have eaten is probably mostly meat and fat. Right? There wouldn't have Huh?
So, but to make the meat by the animals,
Yeah?
you would also need carbohydrates to feed them.
Sure, right? But these would have been wild animals, right? So yeah, I mean the wild animals would have been eating grasses and roots and things that they eat. But humans probably wouldn't have eaten those things. They probably would have focused on lots of meat, right? So hunted animals, birds, fish, shellfish that you can. Actually, I have some slides on that, but actually, yeah. Hang on, I have slides on that. I'll better answer your question. Yeah, the salmon is a big part of that, though. And again, in kind of the fall, huge numbers of salmon pour back into the rivers of British Columbia so they can lay their eggs, right? And again, people like to catch them. I couldn't resist throwing my dad in there again, but there he is, very happily catching a fish. Let's see here. I actually went fishing with him this fall. There, it was fun.
Are you serious?
Yeah. Am I serious that I went fishing with him?
No.
Yeah, I'm 100% serious. That is my dad. That is it. So, yeah, so it's the salmon that allows people to transition from one to the other, right? That's what allows you people to do this. Yeah, and again, with that change, probably larger populations, but with that switch to harvesting a lot of salmon and storing them and harvesting a lot of berries and storing that, with those changes come all these things, right? Larger populations, more social inequality, more trade between groups, more conflicts between groups. There's some warfare that goes on between First Nations groups here on the coast. It's not the same kind of warfare that we're used to. It's pretty tame, right? But it's still warfare. There's a lot of art that goes along with this that sort of expresses what family or clan people belong to, and lots of complex ceremonies as well. Okay, so lots of kind of cultural and social and economic complexity comes out of larger numbers of people living together, right? Which is really the same thing that we saw with civilizations, right? When the numbers of people increase, people have to find more complex ways to live in larger groups, right? And so the same thing is kind of happening, but also it's a very different thing, right? It's a complexity based on hunting and gathering, not on farming, right? So similar, but also different. Yeah, so we figure that in BC during this period, there's probably around 200,000 or 300,000 Indigenous people in British Columbia, which actually is kind of a lot. It doesn't sound like a lot now, but for pre-European times and for people that hunt and gather, that's a lot of people. Yeah, most of the people were found along the northwest coast here because that's where most of the food is, right? We've got lots of animals, we've got lots of fish in the rivers, we've got all sorts of animals in the ocean, we've got shellfish, right, like mussels and clams and crabs and things like that. Some Indigenous people living on the other side of Vancouver Island actually used to hunt whales. And so they had boats and they had harpoons that they made, and they would actually go out and hunt whales, if you can believe it, which is crazy, right? Imagine going out in a boat that you made and sticking a pointy thing into a whale. Yikes. Dangerous, right? But they did it. Yeah, so there's some, I'm going to skip over that, that's not important. One of the ways that we can kind of distinguish different areas of BC is looking at people's housing, how people lived, okay? What kind of structures people lived in. And so if you'll remember, when we were talking about the Hadza, they lived in those very simple structures, right? Because they moved around so much. They kind of bent a tree over and they added some grass and maybe some blankets, and it was just this sort of temporary little dome that they lived in for a few nights. But here we're going to see stuff that's much more permanent, right? So here on the northwest coast, you'll see winter villages that are really really have big, sort of complex houses made of wood, okay? So these are people where multiple families would live in each house, and they would live in these houses during the winter months. So like now, for instance. I'm just going to jump ahead here because, yeah, so they were built on frames that looked like this. And so the indigenous people here on the west coast would build these sort of massive frames with big logs. And okay. And then cover them with planks of wood. And they'd all be made out of cedar trees. So that's kind of the skeleton or the frame. And then when you put the planks over them, you would kind of seal it off like this. And they were often painted with, big designs. Out front you can see a totem pole here, where we'll talk about totem poles a little bit later. Yeah, sorry, Arya, what were you going to say?
The house is made by cedar wood.
Yeah. Do you guys know what a cedar tree is? Have you seen them here? Yeah.
It's very professional for like use in musical instrument
Yeah.
because it makes a good sound.
Yep.
The high and it's damaged very like it's very good wood, I think.
It's a
What
good.
what is most expensive?
It's a good wood. It can be expensive. It's kind of soft, right? So if it's a musical instrument, you have to be careful with it because it'll dent quite easily. But lots of it grows around here, right, on the northwest coast. It smells fantastic. Cedar smells great, especially if it gets wet. It smells fantastic. It's very resilient to moisture because, of course, it grows in a moist climate. Cedar trees tend to be really big, so you can actually, make these big planks, or you can make these big logs because cedar trees are huge. But yeah, these are the kind of houses that people would live in during the winter. And again, multiple families would live in the same house. The families of higher status would live in the back of the house because it's warmer. And then the lower status families would live near the front of the house because that's where the door is and it's colder up there. So, yeah, so big houses like this. Here's another kind of, I think this is at the Museum of Anthropology actually. Just kind of like a model of what these houses might have looked like, right? But really big, really well built, nice and warm for the winter, and again, lots of families living inside them. Yeah. I think we will see this on Friday.
So you are not going to just the museum.
Well, that's outside the museum. Yeah. Yeah, so lowest ranked families are kind of near the door. The highest ranked families are kind of living in the back of the house where it's warmer. And often you see the sort of evidence of the family group painted on the front of the house, right? So you would know whose family lives in this house based on the design on the front. Let's see. Yeah, and so inside the house you'd have all kinds of built-in storage, right? There'd be lots of places to store food for the winter, places to sleep where you're kind of off the ground because it's cold to sleep on the ground. And so pretty nice, warm, comfortable place to spend the winter, right? With all your family. This is what you might find at the very, very back of some of these big cedar houses. And this is kind of a place for ritual, right? So if you're having a big party, or if you're having a ceremony, if you're having a ritual dance, you do it here at the back of the house. And so They'd have a fire burning. That thing that you see in front is actually a drum, again made of a cedar tree, and so you'd have 2 or 3 drummers sitting at it, drumming on it. There's kind of a, you can see some sort of mini totem poles here and some designs, and this is where they would kind of dance and sort of act out their ritual, right in front of this kind of backdrop. And it's probably worth saying too that the ritual of people on the northwest coast here is very performative, right? So when they're doing their dances and rituals, there's lots of costumes and masks that are used, and it's almost like a little play, right? It's almost like a little, so it's kind of part ritual, part religious, but actually part sort of performance, theater performance, if you will. And so you can see right in the front there, you can see a couple of masks of probably a thunderbird there. And you'll see lots of masks on Friday as well. There's tons of them. They had masks and costumes for all of their kind of mythological characters, and they could kind of act them out in dance. And so it's really interesting and cool, actually. What else do I have here? Oh yeah, and so a village might look something like this, a winter village. You can see all the houses are kind of facing the beach. You can see some totem poles that have been raised. Those totem poles sometimes are kind of markers of a family. So if if you're paddling up to the village in your boat, you could look at the totem poles and know which families or which clans lived there. Some of the totem poles are there because they tell stories, right? So they've taken a story and they've put the characters of the story onto the totem pole, so people kind of are reminded of the story. Some of them are just decorative, some of them just look nice, right? Which they do, they're pretty cool. But yeah, that's what a winter village might have looked like. And so maybe a few hundred people living together during the winter, eating their stored food, doing their ceremonies, and things like that, right? When the weather is kind of cold and wet, like it often is here. This is another village here too, but this is one that's a little bit further down the coast. So not all indigenous people, of course, made their houses the same way. The ones that we saw kind of here and here and here, these are houses that you would see kind of here and a little further north. If you went further south, you would see houses that looked more like this. Whoops, more like this. Nope, more like that. So that's maybe like Oregon or Northern California, that people would live in wooden houses that looked a little more like this. Yeah, so maybe a little less fancy. The trees are a little smaller, maybe, but yeah. But you can see these kind of wooden houses that are built to, house multiple families, and they're places where people can sleep and eat and relax and just kind of stay warm and dry, right? Yeah, so winter villages tended to be a few hundred people living in one place, but then in the summer, people would kind of break up, right? They'd split up and go off into different parts of the province. They'd be living in sort of smaller, more simple houses or shelters, and then, of course, in the winter, they'd come back and live in the winter village with everyone, right? So, again, they were mobile, but not mobile all the time, right? Simple foragers are always on the move. These foragers kind of move a few times a year, right? From their winter village, maybe to their spring place where they tend to live, maybe a summer place, maybe in fall they're living somewhere else, and in winter they come back and live in the winter village, right? Yeah, and so when people were, away from the winter village in the spring or summer, they'd make more temporary shelters, right? Just simple things that worked, for a few months, and then they would move on, right? So other times of the year, people are living in more simple structures. In the winter, they're living in the big house. Right? Now, if you move into the interior of British Columbia, so if anyone's been into Kamloops or Kelowna or kind of around there, you'll see a different type of house being used. You'll see what's called a pit house. And it's called a pit house because it's actually dug into the ground. And so I'll show you some pictures here in a second. And what you do is you kind of dig a big circular hole in the ground, maybe, I don't know, 8 feet deep, maybe 2 meters or maybe a little bit more. Big circular hole in the ground. And then you build a structure on top of it. So the house is kind of half below ground and half above. Okay? And it looks something like this from the outside. Actually, it doesn't really look like much from the outside. But underneath that kind of dome, and you'll see in a minute, it's made out of wood and covered with branches and things. There's kind of an underground part of it as well. And that thing sticking out the top is actually a ladder. And so it's a log that they've cut steps into. So you go up the top of the house and then you climb down the ladder. And when you get in,
Sorry, it's quarries under the ground.
yeah.
So if the earthquake happens, they will destroy everything.
If they're what?
The earthquake happens.
Say that one more time.
If the earthquake.
Oh, if there's an earthquake. I think these houses are probably pretty earthquake proof, right? Because they're not standing above the ground. They're actually really low, so they're probably okay actually.
But how is it possible to make the floor under the ground and around it's full with the soil?
Yeah, well, it's because I guess it's kind of hard soil, right? It's not loose. Like it's not loose and crumbly. It's kind of wet, and so it doesn't just collapse, right? And it would look kind of something like this. So here's a pit house where they've kind of built it. This is in a museum in Victoria. They built a pit house, but they've just taken the covering off it, right? So all of the branches that would cover it, they've just taken those off so that you can see the structure. And yeah, this is what it looks like. Most of that is below ground, and you can see they've kind of dug into the ground so that you don't have to sleep right on the floor, right? You can sleep on a little flat platform. There's a fire in the middle there. You can see they've got some people working with looks like bow and arrows there on the mat. So somebody's maybe making arrows or fixing their arrows. Yeah, it looks pretty comfy actually. And again, particularly in the winter, right? Because you're below ground, you're kind of low, you've got a nice fire going inside. It's probably pretty warm and cozy in the winter, right? So these pit houses are something you find kind of in the interior of British Columbia, where the winters are a little colder, a little more snow, and so people devise these pit houses, right? And I think actually there was a course, this might have been at UBC or maybe it was somewhere else, where you could actually part of the course was building a pit house. And so here's some students who got together and built one. And so you can kind of see how they've dug under the ground, right? They've created this open space, and then they've built a structure over top of it, right? And yeah, pretty cool, pretty warm and cozy. Yeah, so those pit houses have, the way to get in and out is just through a hole in the roof with kind of a ladder. And again, people could live in those in the winter, and then in the summer they could go out and live in more temporary shelters, right? Because it's warmer, you don't need to protect yourself from the cold or from the snow. And so again, these are kind of winter houses, just like the big ones that people on the coast have. So here, to answer your question, Aryan, um, what on earth did people eat? Well, lots of meat, lots of seafood, lots of fat. Okay, so this is a part of the world where even though we grow things here today, we grow lots of fruits and vegetables here today. Probably not a ton of fruits and vegetables used thousands of years ago, right? So people were eating a lot of salmon, right, because they stored it away. They were also eating lots of other fish as well, right? So this ulakan, that's a type of fish, sturgeon, herring, trout, all of these are different types of fish, right? They also ate sea mammals, and so seals or sea lions, sometimes porpoises, sometimes whales, right? And so again, people on the far coast of Vancouver Island, they built large canoes, large boats out of cedar trees. They created harpoons out of wood and out of shells from mussels. They created floats out of the stomach of large animals. And they actually went out there and hunted whales and were actually successful, believe it or not. Again, I can't think of anything more dangerous than sneaking up to a whale and sticking something pointy in it, but yeah, they were able to do this kind of stuff. So sea mammals were on the menu, shellfish, clams, mussels, lobsters, crabs, all of those things were on the menu, right? No? You're not into it? You are into it? You're not into it? Mammals and birds, of course, so anything they could hunt on land, whether it was deer or elk or moose or rabbits, any of the birds that are around here, ducks, geese, anything, any of those could have been eaten and were eaten. So again, lots of different types of food here, right? Lots of meat, lots of fat, not a ton of carbs, but they're around, right? Oh yeah, so here's a few pictures of some varied Northwest Coast foods, right? So on the top left there, you can see the ulakan or the candlefish, which people generally ate for their oil. They're a super oily fish, and so people would boil them up, collect the oil, and kind of use it to cook with. And so really fatty fish. There's a seal. I don't know if I could eat such a cute thing, but they ate them. There's a salmon you can see there. There's a whale and a porpoise. At the bottom there, you can see a marmot, which is kind of a mountain-dwelling rodent. They would have eaten those. There's some mussels and oysters there. There's a deer. There's a partridge in the middle. Again, lots of different types of animal food, right? Yeah. Here's a painting of a woman digging clams, right? So you can see this, there's a clam bed there. She's got her boat and a basket that she's woven. And she's just digging clams out of the beach. Right? But even so, you know, a huge amount of what they would have eaten would have been animal food, but there's also lots of plants around here too. And I imagine that, like in terms of calories, most of their diet would have come from animals or fish or shellfish. But again, there were some plant foods to be eaten, right? So lots of roots and bulbs and shoots and buds and leaves. And again, indigenous people would have known all of these, right? Where to find them, which ones were tasty and which ones weren't, how to prepare them, right? What type of, or what time of the year they were available. All of this they would have known, right? Let's see. Wow, there's a lot of text on here. I've really got to edit some of these down. Lots of plant material. That's that's that. I'd like to talk a little bit about technology, but first I'd like to maybe take a bit of a break. I feel like I've been talking a lot here. So let's take a little break, and then when we come back, I'll just show you a few technological things. Then we'll talk about field trip and final project. Okay? So take 10. Okay, we're back. Let's do a little more technology and then we'll talk about final project stuff, okay? So, people here on the Northwest Coast had some very sophisticated and interesting technology. So, with most hunter-gatherers, their technology is kind of limited because they move around so much, right? The only things you can really have as a simple forager is stuff you can carry with you, right? You don't want to be carrying a lot of heavy stuff because you move so much. But people in this part of the world, they stayed in one place for longer, and so they tended to create things, right? They tended to create stuff. So let me show you some example of some fishing and kind of some fishing technology, right? So let me show you here. Lots of projectile points for hunting or for fishing. So some of these things you see in this glass case are spear points or arrow points. So you would have different arrows for birds, different arrows for big animals. The ones with the big jagged teeth on them, those are harpoons. And so if you were fishing for really big fish or seals, you would use these harpoons to sort of stick into them. Oh yeah, here's a little artistic photo here. But you can see these people hunting whales, right? So you can see here they've got a wooden shaft here. There's a point that's made out of a mussel shell. It's probably about this big. They've got rope, which they've woven together, probably out of cedar bark. They have these floats that they've created from the stomachs of like elk and moose, and so they kind of blow them up and they're like a big balloon. And when you hunt whales, you just try and stick as many of these into the whale as possible. And if you stick enough floats in them, it'll be difficult for them to go under the water, and then you just keep stabbing at them until they die, kind of thing, which sounds brutal. But what's what? Yeah, it's possible. Yeah. 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 It's possible. They did it. On the right side?
No, on the boat.
Oh yeah, this thing. That round thing? Yeah, it's the stomach of a moose or an elk.
Oh, no.
It's a float. So you take this, you stick it into the whale, the point detaches from the harpoon shaft, and then the point is connected to a rope, which is connected to the float. Right? And so the whale is trying to, dive under the water to stay away from you, and you keep tagging it with these inflatable balloons, basically. And so if you keep attaching balloons to this thing, it can't dive under the water anymore because the air is holding it up, right? And so you keep doing that until the whale is forced to stay at the surface, and then you just keep stabbing it until you can kill it. I don't think it attacks, but it definitely doesn't like what's going on, so it's super dangerous. What's that? Yeah, super high risk. But think about how much food you would get from a whale, right?
Enough for 4 months or more.
Yeah, you'd have meat and fat and bones to make tools and yeah, I mean, you might be out there for a month hunting for a whale, but if you finally got one, huge, right? What's that? Yeah, certainly possible. I mean, the indigenous people were smart enough not to be totally reckless, right? Like you do want to go out there and hunt a whale, but you don't want to die doing it, right? So lots of times they just didn't succeed. Lots of times the whale got away. Maybe they couldn't even get close enough to a whale to stick a harpoon in him. it's tough, right? But again, if you that one time you are successful, I mean, you'd be buried in meat and fat, right? It would be awesome.
How could they fit their oil in that small boat?
Say again?
How could they fit their oil in that small boat?
How could they?
Carry it back home.
Oh, well, there'd probably be a few boats, and then they would tow the whale back to. They would drag the whale back to their village. A lot of work, right? A lot of work. A lot of, probably a few people, like a few canoes full of guys trying to do this. Not easy, dangerous, a lot of work. But, again, can you imagine how much meat there is on a whale? Right? You'd have meat for the rest of the year, right? If you can take down one whale.
What if they suddenly met another tribe while hunting a whale and they look exactly the same?
The same whale? Well, they'd probably be from the same village, right?
What if they're from different places?
Oh, I don't know. I don't know if that ever happened, right? Because most of these groups have their own kind of territory, and they stay in their own territory, so you probably wouldn't, it's possible. I don't know. I don't think anyone would try and steal a whale from anyone else. There's lots of whales in the ocean, as they say. Or is that fish in the sea? Whatever. So, that's pretty exciting, of course, the whaling. But you can see there's also other technologies as well, right? So here's people fishing, and so they built kind of a weir, right? So this kind of fence is in a river, and they're separated. The gap is big enough for some smaller fish to go through, right, and the water to pass through. But the bigger fish are going to have a hard time, right? So if you stand up here with your spear, the bigger fish are trying to get through, and you can just stick them and put them in your basket. Right? You just stand out there, like shooting fish in a barrel, if you will. Right? So here's kind of a historical picture of one, and I think I've got a more modern picture too. Oh yeah, there's a guy spearing fish. Oh, yeah. This was a video actually, but the whole thing, it's a family of bears crossing the river. But this is really what you need to see. So there's a modern one that they built, right? Pretty simple, right? And yet, again, the big fish are gonna struggle to get through, and it's gonna make it very easy to just stick them, put them in a basket, bring them onto the shore, take the guts out of them, hang them up to dry. Easy peasy, right? So yeah, with a little bit of technology, this hunting and gathering thing isn't too difficult, right? But again, you do need to know, you need to understand your environment, you need to know how to build this stuff, and it's really effective. Yeah, so here's some salmon being dried. That's good wild salmon right there. Lots of the farm salmon you see in the store is kind of a light pink color. Not good. That's the good stuff right there. You want a nice deep, like red pink color. That's the...
So it's too hard to find salmon like this.
Yeah, it is hard to find, unfortunately. But the wild stuff is way better for you than the farm stuff. But yeah, that looks great. But yeah, they're drying that fish, right, or smoking it, and they'll keep it for the winter. Here's some people netting these eulicon, right? These are these tiny little, there we go, these tiny little fish I showed you a picture of earlier, and they're really oily. And so here we have some First Nations people out. They've got their boats, they've got a big net, and at certain times of the year you can just scoop the net in and dump them and just fill your boat up with these little fish, right? Then they would boil up the fish, the oil comes to the top, skim the oil off, and you keep it for the winter, right? And then you can cook with, it's oil you can cook with, right? Yeah, so there they all, there's a bunch of these smaller fish drying, so they're drying them out to store them away. Right? Yeah, so kind of some simple things, but used very effectively, right? Nets, little fish dams, spears, and yet you can produce a lot of food that way, right? Lots of things that were gathered, so things that the women went out to gather, usually were put in these baskets that were woven. And the baskets, I know baskets doesn't sound very exciting. The baskets are incredible. So here's an example of one. And this is all woven together with cedar bark and plant material. And some of them are, good morning, some of them are woven so well that they're actually watertight. Like you can actually put water in them. They're so well woven, which is unbelievable, right? But these people are very, very skilled at what they do. And so, you know, there were baskets like this made from cedar bark. They were also making hats and clothing from the bark of the cedar tree as well. Maybe I have a picture of that. Maybe I don't. But yeah, you can see this technology is very, very kind of, it appears simple, but the skill to be able to do it is actually quite complicated, right? And so that doesn't look like much, but I dare you to make anything like it, right? You really need to know what you're doing to pull bark off a tree and turn it into something like that, right? Something that will, you know, last for years, right? Okay, I'm going to press pause on that. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about your final project, okay? So this is just kind of the first thing, as I mentioned. I'll give you some more direction on this project as we go forward. I'll give you a marking guide sort of thing so that you'll know a little more clearly what I'm looking for. But I'll introduce it to you here just so you know what's happening and you can start doing some work, okay? So here it is. I will post this on Microsoft Teams just a little bit later today. Yes, this takes the place of your final exam because there is no final exam in this class. This is your final exam. So treat it as such, okay? So what you'll be doing in this assignment is doing a little bit of research, compiling your information, organizing it into a presentation, and then presenting to us in class, right? You will be the experts on your topic. You will teach us or kind of tell us what you have discovered, what you've researched, tell us what you know, okay? So you will do some research, assemble your presentation, you'll go up, you'll present it to us, maybe we'll ask you some questions if we're curious about things. Yeah.
Any question?
Yeah.
Can we use a movie, a film, and photo?
No, but let me get to that. Okay? Well, yes and no. Yes and no. But let me get to it. So you can work in pairs or you can work individually. It is up to you. If you work in pairs, I want to make sure that I see a team working, right? So I've done this before where two people decide to work together and they're like, okay, you take the first half, I'll take the second half. They go their separate ways. They work on their own and then they come together and like stick their thing together. And their presentation has like two different themes and two different formats and they clearly haven't talked to each other since the first day, and I don't want that. If you're gonna work with someone, I want you to work with them and work on your presentation together. I don't want two halves that people have worked on, okay? Your presentation is going to be about 10 minutes, no less than that. I know that sounds like a long time. It will actually be a short time, but it sounds like a long time. And the assignment will be in 3 pieces, Okay? First part is simply just finding sources. Okay? So you'll find 6 sources. You'll put them in a list. You'll format it according to MLA style, and you'll hand it in to me. What?
You just put in which subject?
Say that one more time.
You just have to put in which subject?
Yes. Yeah, that's it. More about that later. So there's that. There's the presentation itself. Again, you'll need to create a keynote or a PowerPoint or some such thing that will be kind of behind you while you speak. Your PowerPoint or your keynote can have text, like words on the slides. You can have pictures. You can have graphs. You can have maps. You can have illustrations or paintings like I've used sometimes. No videos though, thank you. I want to hear what you have to say. I want to hear what you've learned. I don't want to watch TV. So no videos, just you and what's on the board, okay?
Like the sources, you mean like Wikipedia or?
Video can be a source, but we'll talk about that. We'll talk about that in a little bit more detail tomorrow, okay?
So what is the title?
I'll get to that too. Okay, so the presentation part, and we'll do presentations in the last week of class, okay, which I think is November 29th to December the 3rd, okay, so that's coming up pretty quick. We will have some class time to work on this as we go forward, okay, so I promise to give you that. And then there's a peer feedback piece of this. So while people are up there presenting, we're going to pay attention to them, and then at the end of their presentation, we'll have a little thing to complete about maybe what we learned and one question we still might have. Okay? So 3 kind of pieces to this, but keep in mind you have to kind of do them, not kind of, you have to do them all, right? You can't just do a little bit here, a little bit there. I need all 3 pieces from you. Yeah, so grade breakdown is there. I will give you some more detail about how I'm going to grade these things before you hand everything in so that you know what I'm looking for. Here are the 3 topics, okay? So there's 3, did I say 3 topics? I think there's 3. There's 3 topics, but you have kind of room to choose within those topics as well. Your topic needs to be approved by me before you get going, okay? And this is a service to you. This is for you, not for me. In the past, I've had some students who don't check their topic with me beforehand, and they wind up going in the wrong direction or doing the wrong thing. They don't tell me, and then when they get up and do their presentation, it's like, oh, it's not, you didn't do what you were supposed to, or you misunderstood the assignment. And then it's a, so, for you, not for me, check with me beforehand so I can say, yes, that looks good, or close, but try to go this way, or that's not going to work, but how about this? Check with me beforehand so I can make sure that you're pointed in the right direction, okay? Because you don't want to get up there and it's like, oh, you misunderstood, right? Or you went the wrong way. That's no good for anyone, right? So you have to check with me beforehand so I can make sure that you are going in the right direction. Okay, so 3 topics. Number 1, there's a historical, of course, only do one of these, don't do all 3. A historical comparative cultures topic, right? So how can we take what we've learned about ancient cultures in this course, and how can we use it to better understand our own? Okay? So that's kind of the bigger question of your presentation. And then you can see I've added some smaller questions to help kind of guide you in what you're thinking. Okay? So one has to do with how can we take what we've learned about ancient culture and apply it to our modern culture here. Okay? Second one has to do with cultural expressions. So how does a culture's art or music embody its social or religious values? Okay? So this is kind of an influence of culture over culture expression. How does one influence the other? And again, got some questions to help guide you. Third one is culture and in the environment. So how does the physical environment shape human culture? Okay? And that's kind of come up a few times in this course in different ways. Okay? And again, I've added some questions to help guide you. Okay? So that's basically what it is. Again, you'll do your research. I don't really want to hear the same things that we've already heard. Okay? So if you choose, if you choose one of these and it somewhat deals with a culture that we've already dealt with, that's kind of okay, but I don't want to hear the same things that we've already done. Okay? I want to hear some new stuff, right? I want to see you research new material, new information, and show us some new things. Okay? Don't just tell us what we've already done, because we know what we've already done because we're the ones who did them. Right? So show me something new. If you happen to mention something that we've done before, I guess that's okay, but I want fresh material here. Okay? Let's see. I think that's what I have to tell you. Do you have any? You can ask questions at any time, but do you have any questions that are kind of popping up for you right now?
So like Asian culture is to compare our own culture.
A-
Because
a- a-
example,
did you say Asian culture?
Asian
Ancient?
culture. Like for example, like we talk like about Mesopotamia,
Yeah.
we learn about India,
Yeah.
we learn about China,
It-
etc.
yes, but
So
it,
if I take China as the first project, I still use China, modern China to compare.
yes. So that's the thing, right? Is that you within these kind of topics, you may, it may work for you to kind of focus on one culture or two cultures, or it might make sense to focus on a bunch, right? Like, let's say culture and environment, right? How does the physical environment shape culture? Well, I wonder how cultures understand earthquakes. Right? Lots of cultures have experienced earthquakes, but what are they? How do they think about them? Right? How do we see earthquakes showing up in myth or something like that? So in that case, it might make sense to look at a bunch of different cultures, right? Because the common thing you're looking at is earthquakes, right? But for something like number two, it might make sense to just stick with one culture and talk about their art or music, maybe, right? I don't know, but you can kind of go a few different ways, right? There's lots of things you could talk about. You can talk about one culture or two, or you can talk about many cultures if you're talking about one thing, like earthquakes or something like that. So there's a lot of room for you to kind of maneuver, I think, within each topic. Right? Hopefully. Other questions?
Our reference should be from the lessons that we already learned or not?
No, I want you to find new things, right? I want you to find new things, but also keep in mind, if you can, that because this kind of serves as a final exam, I want to see evidence that you've been here. I want to see evidence that you've learned something in here. So if you can kind of, try to show me that, right? Try to show me that you've learned things in here, that there are things that we understand now that we didn't understand before this class, and show me that you've kind of learned those things, right? Without simply telling me what we've already done. Okay?
The person that
Okay. Another good question. Can I talk about my own culture? Okay. You can. However, part of this part of this assignment is your ability to kind of research things. So you may have some personal kind of understanding of Iranian culture, which of course you do, right? But I also want to see that supported with other sources. So it might make it, like if you wanted to talk about, how can we use what we've learned about an ancient culture to better understand our own? Yeah, you should talk about Iran for sure, but I also want to see some support from sources that you find. So I don't just want it to be, it can be some of your thinking, like some of your thinking and how you see things, but I also want to see some sources supporting that as well. So it's a yes but is the answer to that. Yes, you can, but I don't just want to see you talking about things you already know. I want to see you talking about things you already know with some support from other sources. Okay? Good question. Good question. Okie dokie. All right. So here's what I'm going to do. So for online people, I'm gonna end class there to give you some time to think about maybe some of the things that you might want to look at for this assignment. Again, I'm going to post it on Microsoft Teams in just a few minutes, so you'll have it to look at. And again, we'll come back to it tomorrow because we're going to talk about the source part of the assignment, and I'll probably give you some time to work on that as well. Okay. So online people, I'll turn you loose, and we'll see you tomorrow. As I say, use this time to kind of think about maybe some of the things you might want to look at for this project, okay? So see you tomorrow. Have a good afternoon. Bye.